Freddie Figgers was born into in 1989, carried none of the metallic thunder of tanks or the distant rumble of wartime convoys. Yet the echoes of old battles still shaped the society around him. He grew up in Quincy, Florida, in a quiet corner of the American South, where old barns leaned into the wind and telephone lines stretched across long country roads like faded scars from the past. It was a place that remembered hardship well, where stories of earlier generations, struggling through wartime rationing or military service, lived beside the ordinary routines of rural life. Freddie's adoptive father, Nathan, carried some of those memories. He had never fought in a world war, but he had grown up listening to men who had. They spoke of uncertainty, of working with whatever tools they had, of finding solutions when the world gave them none. Freddie listened too, absorbing the message without knowing it. From the beginning, Freddie approached the world through curiosity rather than fear. Nathan and Betty Figgers had taken him in when he was just a newborn, abandoned in a field with no one to claim him. They chose him before he could choose anything, and they raised him in a home where faith and determination were stronger than any obstacle. Nathan worked long days repairing broken things for neighbors who could not afford to replace them. Sometimes it was a pump, sometimes a screen door, sometimes an old clock that had not ticked in years. Freddie watched the way his father handled every problem as if it could be solved, even when it looked beyond saving. That attitude became the foundation of Freddie's world. By the time he was 9 years old, he was already taking apart radios and flashlights, lining their small metal organs on the kitchen table like a surgeon learning anatomy. Nathan did not always understand what the boy was doing, but he saw the same relentless curiosity that once drove wartime engineers to improvise entire communication systems from scrap. Freddie never saw himself in such grand terms. He simply wanted to know how everything worked. One afternoon, the chance that would change his life arrived in the form of a discarded computer. It sat in the corner of the City Hall building, a beige tower scarred with scratches and dust. The officials had written it off as dead, a relic too old and too broken to justify repair. When Nathan asked whether he could take it home for his son, they shrugged. To them, it was one less piece of junk to haul away. To Freddie, it was a machine that still had a heartbeat, even if no one else could hear it. He set it on the kitchen counter as though it were a puzzle waiting to be solved. Removing the screws felt like opening a sealed vault. He examined the motherboard, the power supply, the tangle of ribbon cables, each component speaking a language he had never formally learned but somehow understood. When he powered it on and heard nothing, he refused to believe it had taken its last breath. He traced the problem to a tiny crack in the board, a fracture so small an adult might have missed it. Freddie soldered a bridge across the damaged path using a cheap iron that barely held temperature. When he finished, he wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and held his breath as he pressed the power button again. The machine hummed to life. Nathan stared at the glowing screen with disbelief. But Freddie felt something different. It was not pride and not luck. It was recognition. He had awakened a silent machine, and in doing so, he discovered a world that would never again feel unreachable. Word of what he had done traveled faster than he expected. Quincy was small, and stories moved through it like wind across tall grass. Neighbors brought him more broken devices, a radio that cut out without warning, a calculator that would not hold numbers. Eventually, someone even handed him a second-hand computer that crashed every time it opened a program. Freddie fixed each one with the steady focus of a young technician in a wartime communications hut, except his battles were quiet and fought with patience rather than urgency. School, however, was different. Children did not always see talent the way adults did. Freddie was bright, but he was also different. He preferred machines to sports and spent his free moments thinking rather than talking. Some children mocked him for it, laughing when he carried old electronic parts in his backpack, or when he spoke with enthusiasm about a repair he had completed. They did not know they were witnessing the beginnings of a mind that would one day build technologies used across the country. They only saw a boy who loved broken things. Nathan watched the way his son walked through those early tests. Each morning, Freddie left for school with his shoulders squared, and each afternoon he returned with a new idea. It reminded Nathan of the resilience he had seen in older men who lived through harsher times. They had never talked about surrender, because surrender had never been an option. Freddie had inherited that spirit, even though he had never marched through the mud of any battlefield. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the oak trees and cast long shadows across their yard, Nathan found Freddie sitting on the porch steps with the repaired computer beside him. The machine was running an old typing program, and Freddie stared at the lines on the screen as if they held some secret future only he could see. Nathan sat beside him and asked what he planned to do with the knowledge he was gaining. Freddie answered without hesitation. He wanted to build things, not just repair them. He wanted to create something that mattered. Nathan listened, understanding more than he let on. Sometimes a person's calling revealed itself early, and sometimes it arrived disguised as a broken relic in a dusty corner. In Freddie's case, it was both. The computer he had resurrected had become the gateway to a world larger than Quincy, larger than anything the boy had ever imagined. The night grew darker, but Freddie did not move from the glowing screen. His eyes reflected the blue light with the same determination his father had once seen in veterans who rebuilt their lives after war. It was the determination of someone who believed the future could be shaped by hands willing to work, and a mind willing to push past what others thought impossible. He did not know it yet, but this quiet chapter of his childhood would become the foundation of a journey that would defy expectations and challenge everything people assumed about where genius could be born. The world would one day hear his name. For now, all it heard was the steady hum of a machine brought back from silence by a 9-year-old who refused to accept that anything was beyond repair. And as the screen flickered in the darkness, Freddie leaned closer, ready for whatever came next. Freddie Figgers grew into adolescence with a mind that seemed to outrun the world around him. Quincy remained slow and familiar, its days marked by the steady rhythm of rural life. Yet inside Freddie's head, ideas moved with the speed of modern circuitry. By the time he turned 15, he was no longer the quiet boy tinkering with broken radios. He was someone searching for patterns, building systems, and imagining solutions long before most people realized a problem existed. His teachers saw glimpses of his ability, but they could not always understand the scale of it. Freddie's thoughts lived in a future the town had not yet reached. Computers had become his workshop, playground, and battlefield. Each evening he hunched over a desk crowded with frayed wires and half-assembled towers. His room smelled of warmed plastic and solder, a scent that clung to the furniture and drifted into the hallway. His parents would walk past the door and hear furious typing, punctuated by the soft hum of cooling fans. Freddie was not simply using computers. He was shaping them into tools that matched the tempo of his mind. During these years, the world outside his window seemed to echo with distant reminders of conflict. The United States was engaged in the war on terror, and news reports were filled with footage of soldiers patrolling dusty streets or transporting equipment across rugged terrain. Freddie followed those broadcasts not for the violence, but for the infrastructure behind them. He studied how troops communicated, how data moved, and how failures in technology sometimes forced soldiers to improvise under pressure. Although he had never witnessed battlefield communication firsthand, he understood the stakes. A single misrouted message could alter an entire operation. A malfunctioning device could cost lives. The thought stayed with him. He also began studying the history of wartime innovation, particularly the way the Second World War had pushed engineers to think faster than anyone believed possible. Freddie read about Alan Turing and the teams who cracked German codes, about the development of radar, and about the field technicians who repaired radios under fire so that commanding officers could communicate across continents. These stories resonated deeply with him. He admired not the glory of war, but the brilliance of those who refused to be defeated by complexity. They were problem solvers. They were inventors. They were the kind of people he hoped to become. It was this blend of inspiration and necessity that led Freddie to his first real software project. A local nursing home struggled to keep track of residents who wandered off the property. Staff members tried everything from paper logs to mismatched digital tools, but nothing worked reliably. When Freddie heard about the issue, he studied the problem for less than a day before deciding he could build something better. He envisioned a system that would monitor each resident's location through a networked device and alert staff the moment someone stepped beyond a safe range. He did not have the resources of a research lab or the backing of a corporation. What he had was determination and a second-hand computer he had repaired into working condition. With that machine, he began writing lines of code one after another, sometimes working until dawn, eyes gritty with exhaustion. He taught himself what he did not know, pulling information from manuals, early online forums, and trial and error experimentation. His mistakes became lessons. His progress became momentum. Weeks later, he walked into the nursing home with a functioning program. The administrators were skeptical at first. Freddie looked far too young to be entrusted with anything of significance, and yet when he explained the system, his confidence carried weight. They agreed to test it. When the software successfully helped staff locate a resident who had wandered outside, doubt turned to astonishment. A teenager had solved a problem that had plagued professionals for months. This success introduced Freddie to an entirely new kind of challenge. As word spread, people began seeking his help for issues far more complex than broken electronics. Someone wanted a database built. Someone else needed a system to track inventory. One community group needed assistance building a website to organize local events. Each project broadened the boundaries of his knowledge. But even as his reputation grew, Freddie struggled with the weight of how others perceived him. Some classmates still teased him for being different. Others dismissed him as someone who played with computers but would never become anything meaningful. He learned to ignore the laughter, reminding himself that great innovators throughout history had faced similar doubt. Many wartime engineers, he realized, had been overlooked until their inventions altered the course of history. Their worth had not been recognized until the moment their work became indispensable. Freddie began carrying this understanding like armor. Instead of retreating when challenges arose, he advanced with greater energy. He experimented with building small pieces of hardware. He learned how to configure servers and routers. He studied telecommunications, fascinated by the idea that an invisible signal could bridge miles of physical distance. The deeper he went, the faster his mind seemed to move. At times he felt as if he were racing ahead of his own years, building knowledge that would take most people decades to gather. Then came a turning point that revealed just how far he had traveled from that 9-year-old repairing a discarded machine. A local city official approached him with an unusual request. They needed a secure digital system to help monitor water pressure levels in the municipal pipelines. The existing system was outdated and prone to failure. Freddie listened carefully, recognizing the familiar pattern of a problem rooted in neglect. He agreed to build the solution. He designed a series of sensors that could send real-time data to a centralized console. He built the software to interpret that data. He tested the system until every digit behaved as expected. When he presented the finished product, the officials saw not a teenager, but a young professional who thought like an engineer. They asked how he had learned to build such a system. Freddie had no answer that satisfied them. The truth was simple. He learned it because he needed to, because his mind refused to slow down when the world demanded solutions. As he matured, the distance between his abilities and the scale of his environment widened. Quincy could not contain what he was becoming. Nathan and Betty recognized it too. They watched their son transform into someone whose ideas grew larger than any small-town expectation. In a household that once celebrated repairing broken radios, a new dream was forming, shaped by the hum of servers and the relentless pulse of innovation. Freddie was not yet a CEO. He was not yet a telecommunications pioneer. But he was something just as important. He was a young man building momentum, gathering the tools he would one day use to create an empire. The world beyond Quincy had no idea who he was, but it would soon learn. He stood on the edge of that future, a mind racing faster than the world around him, ready to push beyond every limit that had ever been placed in his path. Freddie Figgers entered his late teens with a confidence forged not from praise, but from persistence. Every system he built, every bug he repaired, every device he coaxed back to life had strengthened a belief planted in childhood, that problems were simply puzzles waiting for the right hands. Yet outside his home, the world did not always celebrate that kind of brilliance, especially when it arrived in the form of a young black man from rural Florida who spoke softly and carried more ideas than most adults knew what to do with. Talent could open doors, but prejudice could close them just as quickly. He learned this truth slowly at first. A man would hand him a malfunctioning computer, thank him for the repair, then look surprised to learn Freddie had been the one doing the work. Another customer would ask him to repeat his explanation, unable to accept that a teenager had just designed a system more advanced than the software their business had been using for years. Doubt followed him, not because his work lacked quality, but because he did not fit the picture people expected of an engineer or a future tech innovator. Freddie carried these moments quietly, but each one reinforced a fire already burning inside him. Still, his determination never wavered. His father watched him work long nights at a folding table that bowed under the weight of old modems and repurposed computer towers. Nathan believed in his son the way a commanding officer believes in a soldier who shows courage under pressure. There was no exaggeration in the way Nathan spoke of him. He knew Freddie had climbed through barriers most adults never saw, and he understood how hard the world could be on a mind that moved faster than convention allowed. As Freddie expanded his skills, the challenges changed shape. Technology was evolving rapidly, and both private businesses and government agencies needed people who could understand the shifting landscape. Cybersecurity was no longer a distant concept. Network infrastructure had become critical to operations across nearly every field. Wireless communication was reshaping the way companies connected employees and customers. Freddie stood at the crossroads of all this change, absorbing knowledge like a sponge placed beneath a rushing stream. But while he grew more capable, the resistance around him also grew. When he applied for certain positions or contracts, some decision-makers dismissed him outright. They saw his youth. They saw his race. They saw his lack of formal credentials compared to those who grew up in wealthier cities or attended renowned universities. They did not see the mind that had been building software since childhood, or the grit that came from solving real problems without any institutional support. Freddie often walked out of these meetings feeling as though he had been judged before he ever spoke. Yet adversity sharpened him. He began studying telecommunications with an intensity that consumed his days. He researched how cell networks operated, how signals were routed, why coverage gaps existed, and how infrastructure could be improved. He knew he lacked the resources of major corporations, but knowledge was a weapon that cost nothing, and Freddie was unafraid to wield it. He spent hours analyzing wireless towers, learning the engineering behind radio frequencies and packet transmission. When he could not afford textbooks, he relied on digital resources and dissected existing technology until he understood its every weakness. Around this time, he started building prototypes of devices that could connect to networks without relying on expensive commercial hardware. He adjusted antennas, rewired circuit boards, and built custom enclosures from salvaged materials. He often tested these creations in the yard outside his home, where Nathan would sit on an upturned bucket and watch the process with quiet pride. Sometimes a device worked. Sometimes it failed spectacularly. Freddie learned from both outcomes. Despite his growing expertise, Freddie encountered a world that still struggled to believe in him. During one early business meeting, a man handed him a stack of papers and asked if he was the assistant responsible for carrying the documents. Freddie explained that he had been invited to consult on a security problem within their network, and the man's expression shifted to disbelief. Moments like this were not uncommon. The question was never whether Freddie knew enough. It was whether people were willing to see past their assumptions. The turning point came when a local company experienced a major data issue. Their system had been corrupted by a software flaw, shutting down operations and threatening to erase months of records. A mutual contact recommended Freddie. The company reluctantly agreed to let him examine their systems, expecting very little. Instead, Freddie uncovered the root of the problem within hours, corrected the flaw, and designed a backup protocol to prevent similar failures. The room fell silent as the system flickered back to life. One executive finally asked how he had diagnosed the problem so quickly. Freddie explained the process step by step, describing how data traffic moved through their network, where the bottleneck had formed, and why the system had collapsed under specific conditions. The explanation was smooth, technical, and unmistakably authoritative. No one in the room doubted him after that, yet even successes carried a shadow. Freddie knew that no single victory could erase the skepticism he encountered. He would need more than skill. He needed a platform large enough to force the world to acknowledge what he could do. Around this time, Nathan's health began to falter. The man who had lifted engines with his bare hands now struggled with memory lapses. On some days he forgot where he had placed his tools. On others he forgot conversations entirely. The doctors called it dementia, a slow unraveling that no amount of strength could resist. Freddie confronted this reality the only way he knew how. He built a device. He created a small tracking unit inside his father's shoe. a piece of technology that sent alerts whenever Nathan wandered beyond a safe distance. It worked seamlessly. The device allowed Freddie to protect the man who had always protected him. But beyond that, it proved something deeper. Freddie had taken personal pain and transformed it into innovation. People began hearing about the invention. Some dismissed it as luck. Others questioned whether he had the credentials to produce something commercially viable. Once again, talent met a world reluctant to embrace it. Freddie realized then that he needed more than inventions. He needed ownership. He needed control. He needed his own company. The idea of founding a telecommunications firm was daunting. The industry was dominated by corporations with global infrastructure, vast funding, and political influence. Starting from Quincy, Florida seemed impossible at best and foolish at worst. But Freddie had lived his entire life overcoming expectations. Every doubt thrown at him only added to the force behind his ambition. He began sketching the blueprint for what would become Figgers Communication, not yet knowing the scope it would reach or the contracts it would one day secure. All he knew was that progress would come from perseverance, and perseverance was something he had never lacked. Freddie was still young, still learning, still battling a world that questioned him. But the tide was turning. Each challenge had strengthened his resolve. Each dismissal had pushed him to grow. And somewhere ahead, beyond the doubt and the long nights at his workbench, history waited for him. He was no longer merely repairing broken things. He was preparing to build something far larger than anyone around him imagined. Freddie Figgers entered adulthood with a vision that seemed far too large for the workshop he had built in the corner of his parents' home. His desk was crowded with recycled electronics and tangled cables, and a row of humming towers cast a faint glow against the walls each night. It was not an office or a laboratory, but it was the birthplace of ambition. The idea that he could build a telecommunications company from this small Florida room sounded unrealistic to almost everyone who heard it. Yet Freddie did not measure possibility by public opinion. He measured it by what he knew could be built from determination, resourcefulness, and a refusal to surrender. He had spent years studying how major carriers operated. He understood the architecture of wireless networks, the vulnerabilities in outdated infrastructure, and the growing demand for reliable digital communication. The industry was expanding faster than regulators could govern, but it remained dominated by companies with enormous financial power. To most people, that dominance made it untouchable. To Freddie, it meant the field was overdue for innovation. One of his earliest goals was to design hardware that could compete with devices on the commercial market. He could not afford an advanced manufacturing facility, so he built prototypes by hand. He ordered components piece by piece, selecting parts that matched his tight budget. He experimented with circuit boards until he produced a phone that could connect to multiple network bands. It was not polished. It lacked the sleek casing of corporate products. But it worked, and every functioning prototype felt like a small victory carved out of thin air. During the day, Freddie worked jobs that kept money coming into the household. At night, he returned to the desk where his unfinished dreams waited. He designed software systems, configured servers, and studied the legal requirements needed to become a licensed telecommunications provider. Federal licensing was complex. The paperwork alone could overwhelm someone with less patience. Freddie faced each step with deliberate care, navigating a system designed for corporations, not individuals. His parents watched this transformation with a mixture of worry and pride. Nathan, whose memory now faded in unpredictable waves, still understood enough to ask about Freddie's progress. On good days, he would sit beside his son, listening to explanations about wireless signals and digital routing with narrowed eyes, trying to follow along. When he forgot details, Freddie repeated them with gentle patience. The dream that Freddie carried did not belong to him alone. It belonged to the man who had taught him to never walk away from a challenge. As Freddie pursued his licensing, he encountered barriers he had expected but hoped would not appear. Some representatives questioned his experience. Others expressed skepticism that an independent black entrepreneur could meet the technical standards required by federal regulators. None of the doubts were spoken with hostility, but the implication lingered in the tone behind the questions. Freddie answered each inquiry with precision, presenting detailed plans for infrastructure, security, and compliance. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had built systems with his own hands and understood exactly how they worked. Months passed in a blur of applications, revisions, and long nights of testing equipment. When the approval finally arrived, granting him authorization to operate as a telecommunications provider, he read the notification twice before letting himself breathe. It did not guarantee success. It did not bring customers. But it gave him legitimacy. And legitimacy was a weapon as powerful as any tool on his workbench. With the license secured, he launched Figgers Communication, a company built from nothing more than his skill, determination, and the spare parts that filled his workshop. There was no corporate headquarters, no marketing department, no team of engineers. There was only Freddie, attempting to build what entire companies had taken decades to construct. He faced a telecommunications landscape dominated by giants, but he approached it like a battlefield where strategy could overcome size. His first major task was establishing coverage. He needed access to network towers, but constructing his own infrastructure was impossible with the resources he had. Instead, he negotiated leasing agreements with larger carriers, paying for bandwidth he could resell to his customers. The process was expensive, draining nearly every dollar he had saved. Yet he persisted, understanding that without coverage, he did not have a company. Then came the customers. Winning them required more than technology. It required trust. Freddie traveled from town to town, meeting with small businesses, community leaders, and local residents. He explained what his company offered, why it was reliable, and why supporting independent technology mattered. Many people hesitated. Telecommunications was not a field associated with new players. But some were willing to take the risk, believing in Freddie's sincerity and clarity. Slowly, the first accounts appeared in his system. Each new customer felt like a milestone. As his subscriber base grew, so did his responsibility. Customer service, technical support, billing, troubleshooting, and network monitoring all fell to him. Some nights, he slept for only 2 or 3 hours, waking to the buzz of a phone alerting him to a service interruption. He fixed outages before most customers realized a problem existed. With time, he reinvested every earning back into the company. He refined his devices, improving battery life, optimizing signal performance, and designing protective casings that could survive real-world use. He studied consumer habits, learning which features mattered most and which complications frustrated users. His goal was not to mimic existing products, but to create technology with purpose. One of his most impactful innovations was rooted in compassion. Inspired by the tracking device he created for his father, Freddie developed a line of smartphones with built-in medical alert functions for elderly users. These devices could notify caregivers if the user fell or wandered. They could transmit location data with precision and send emergency signals without the user needing to take manual action. Families who struggled to care for aging loved ones saw these devices not as gadgets, but as lifelines. As demand grew, Freddie expanded Figgers' communication from a one-person operation into a functioning company with staff, resources, and vision. He upgraded his equipment, secured office space, hired employees, and continued refining the technology that defined his brand. His work gained national attention, particularly in communities that admired his ability to build a telecommunications company from the ground up, a feat rarely achieved without immense capital. The journey was still difficult. Competitors dismissed him. Some advisors warned him he was aiming too high. But Freddie had learned long ago that talent meant little to a world that doubted you unless you proved yourself again and again. And he did. With every device built, every signal transmitted, and every customer who trusted his network, he was no longer the boy repairing discarded machines. He was a founder shaping an industry that had never expected someone like him to enter it. The dream that began on a cluttered table in Quincy was growing into a company with national reach, built entirely from grit, innovation, and belief. Ahead lay a challenge larger than anything he had faced before. A contract that would test everything he had built and prove, once and for all, that the world had underestimated him. The stage was set for the moment that would change everything. Long before his story reached the national spotlight, Freddie Figgers learned that the battlefield of modern technology was as demanding as any conflict fought with weapons and armor. It required speed, precision, and an understanding that a single failure in communication could have consequences far beyond the walls of a server room. He carried this awareness with him as Figgers' communication grew from a fragile startup into a functioning telecommunications company. But nothing in his earlier work compared to the moment when he was approached about a contract that would push him into a new realm of responsibility, one where the stakes echoed the seriousness of wartime logistics. It began quietly, with a phone call from a representative linked to a defense-related contractor. They had heard of his medical alert phones and the reliability of the network he had built. They had also heard about his ability to create custom software systems that could operate under conditions where traditional communication tools struggled. The man asked if Freddie would be interested in discussing a project that required a secure infrastructure and rapid deployment technology. Freddie listened with careful curiosity, sensing the weight behind the request. The meeting was held in a modest government building, not the imposing facility he had imagined. The officials were not military officers in uniform, but analysts and engineers who studied data, communications patterns, and failure points within existing systems. They explained that certain field units operating overseas were experiencing issues with tracking logistical movements. Too often, outdated devices failed to transmit accurate positional data, leaving gaps that complicated supply routes. Troops were not in immediate danger because of these failures, but the inefficiency cost time, fuel, and sometimes mission success. They needed hardware that could withstand rough handling, unstable internet access, and unpredictable climates. They needed software that could transmit encrypted data without depending on fragile infrastructure. They needed a device that could operate almost anywhere, with minimal technical knowledge required from the user. As the officials described the problem, Freddie recognized the familiar pattern of technological inadequacy that had haunted many institutions for years. But here, the consequences were far more serious. He asked precise questions about the operating environment, the bandwidth availability, and the failure rates of the existing devices. The officials exchanged impressed glances. Freddie was young, but he spoke like a senior engineer who had spent years studying field deployment. In truth, he had spent countless nights learning how networks react under stress, how signals degrade in remote regions, and how encryption must adapt to variable speeds. His mind moved through the problem as though mapping a battlefield in real time. They requested a prototype within months. Freddie promised one in weeks. When he returned to his office, he gathered his staff and explained the significance of the project. They listened with a seriousness that matched his tone. Figgers Communication did not have the luxury of oversized budgets or state-of-the-art laboratories. What they did have was creativity, discipline, and a founder who refused to accept limits. Freddie worked alongside his team each night, sketching schematics by hand and refining circuits until the design felt balanced. The device needed a reinforced frame, a battery capable of long operation, a powerful GPS module, and a communication chip that could automatically adapt to available signals. It also needed his software, built to encrypt data packets and send them across networks even when bandwidth dropped to near-dark conditions. The programming required delicate adjustments, ensuring the device could switch from cellular to satellite uplinks without losing information. The first prototype arrived covered in fingerprints, scratches, and solder marks. It did not look like something built for a military contract. It looked like something born from necessity and grit, shaped by hands that understood function mattered more than aesthetics. When Freddie powered it on, the device locked onto a signal instantly. Data flowed. Positioning held steady. Encryption remained solid. Freddie exhaled with relief. The next step was testing. He drove through rural areas where signals weakened, through wooded sections where tall pines blocked towers, and along highways where interference distorted transmissions. The device performed better than expected. Even when coverage dropped to almost nothing, it stored packets and resent them the moment a sliver of bandwidth appeared. Freddie recorded every data point, preparing to present not just a device, but evidence of its reliability. When he returned to the officials with the prototype, they examined it with skepticism. The casing was rough. The buttons lacked polish. Yet when they tested it under simulation, the skepticism melted into concentration. The device maintained connection during high-interference tests. It transmitted coordinates accurately even when other devices failed. They pushed it harder, simulating rapid movement and partial obstruction. The performance remained stable. One engineer looked at Freddie with a mixture of respect and surprise. He asked how Freddie had built a device that reacted to signal loss with such resilience. Freddie explained his approach, detailing how the software prioritized data integrity and how the hardware was optimized for real-world unpredictability. He spoke with calm confidence, though inside he felt the gravity of what he had created. The officials approved a pilot deployment. Within months, the device was in the hands of personnel operating overseas. Reports filtered back through secure channels. The device's improved efficiency. Supply movement became smoother. Field teams reported fewer communication breakdowns. The simplicity of the interface allowed rapid adoption. The rugged hardware withstood heat, dust, and transport. Freddie's work was not changing the battlefield in dramatic ways, but it was strengthening the infrastructure that supported those on the ground. When the officials returned with the full contract, the room felt smaller than it had during their first meeting. The document represented a scale of responsibility Freddie had never imagined when he repaired his first computer at age 9. It represented trust, recognition, and the validation of every night spent soldering components at a cluttered desk. It represented the moment the world acknowledged what he had built. The signing of the contract did not bring fireworks. It brought a quiet sense of arrival. It marked the transition from a young entrepreneur fighting for recognition to a technology provider whose work stood shoulder to shoulder with industry giants. Figgers' communication now carried a responsibility measured not in profits, but in reliability and precision. As Freddie left the building, the sun cast long shadows across the pavement. He understood that success did not erase the doubts he had faced, nor did it erase the challenges ahead. But for the first time, he felt the world meeting him at his level, rather than looking down with skepticism. The battlefield had changed, and so had he. Ahead lay the moment when the world would realize that Freddie Figgers was not merely competing with the future. He was shaping it. The morning Freddie Figgers stepped onto the stage at a national technology conference. He carried none of the outward confidence of a man whose company had just secured a major defense-related contract. His suit was simple, his posture focused, and his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Yet the room he entered, filled with industry executives, engineers, investors, and analysts, would soon understand what government officials, local communities, and early supporters had already learned. Freddie was not simply another entrepreneur. He was the beginning of something that challenged the boundaries of American innovation. The conference hall buzzed with conversation as attendees discussed the latest advancements in telecommunications, digital security, artificial intelligence, and infrastructure modernization. On large displays, major corporations demonstrated hardware built with million-dollar budgets. Their booths glittered with polished prototypes and marketing banners. Amid this polished landscape, Freddie looked like an anomaly. Few knew his story. Fewer still understood what he had achieved with far less funding than the companies surrounding him. But those who had followed the defense contract knew that a shift was coming, one centered on a young inventor from Quincy, Florida. He had been invited to present not because of publicity, but because of performance. The device he built had proven itself under conditions that exposed weaknesses in more established technologies. The contract had circulated quietly in industry circles, sparking curiosity among experts who wondered how a small, independent telecommunications company had managed to outperform competitors with global reach. Many expected to meet a team of seasoned engineers. Instead, they met Freddie. He stepped behind the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began speaking in a calm, steady tone. He did not decorate his story. He did not present himself as a prodigy. Instead, he described the problem he had been asked to solve and the steps he took to build a solution resilient enough for real-world deployment. He spoke of packet loss, fluctuating bandwidth, encryption priorities, and adaptive routing with the ease of someone who had lived inside the technology rather than studied it from afar. As he explained how his system handled data transmission in low-signal environments, a quiet settled across the hall. People who had come expecting a routine presentation leaned forward. Engineers in the crowd studied the diagrams on the screen with surprise, recognizing that the architecture Freddie described did not mimic existing systems. It simplified them while increasing reliability. It reduced points of failure. It reflected an approach rarely seen outside elite research labs. Freddie paused to describe how he had tested the hardware in rural fields, how he had driven miles to force signal loss, how he refined the device until it behaved predictably under unpredictable conditions. He never glamorized the process. He simply told the truth. The story resonated, nonetheless. It represented the kind of American innovation rooted not in privilege but in necessity, experimentation, and grit. When he finished the presentation, the room erupted into applause that startled even Freddie. He stepped back from the podium with a modest nod, but several attendees immediately approached him. A representative from a major carrier asked if he would consider licensing parts of his routing technology. An executive from a logistics company wanted to discuss fleet tracking integration. A cybersecurity specialist requested a deeper conversation about his encryption model. The line of people waiting to speak with him grew until security hinted that they needed to clear the walkway. By the time he left the conference hall, word of his presentation had spread beyond the room. Reporters asked for interviews. Analysts began reviewing Figgers' communication as a rising competitor in telecommunications infrastructure. For years, industry giants had dismissed smaller companies as noise beneath their expansions. Freddie's work forced them to reconsider. He had proven not only that innovation could come from unexpected places, but that independence could outperform institutions. Despite the momentum, Freddie returned home to Quincy that evening rather than staying for celebratory dinners or media tours. His company required attention, and his life remained grounded in the same values that had shaped him since childhood. The lights of the conference hall faded into memory as he drove down familiar roads, past neighborhoods where people remembered the young man who repaired their computers and built early software systems. The world now saw him as a national figure. Quincy still saw him as Freddie. His father, Nathan, was having a good day when Freddie walked through the door. Dementia often clouded Nathan's memories, but the pride he felt for his son broke through the haze with remarkable clarity. Freddie sat beside him, explaining the conference in simple terms. Nathan nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting as he patted his son's shoulder. The gesture carried more meaning than words could convey. It represented the foundation upon which Freddie had built everything. The following weeks brought new challenges. Increased attention meant increased scrutiny. Investors wanted explanations. Analysts wanted projections. Some companies attempted to downplay his accomplishments, suggesting that the defense contract was an isolated success rather than evidence of long-term capability. Freddie met each doubt with calm professionalism, relying on performance rather than persuasion. He continued refining his technology, expanding his network, and designing new hardware that pushed beyond the limits of his previous work. One of the turning points came when he developed a smartphone that integrated hardware and software, entirely engineered within his company. At a time when American telecommunications relied heavily on overseas manufacturing and external development teams, Freddie produced a device built from the ground up by an American firm. It was not a symbolic achievement, it was a strategic one. His company had entered a field where very few dared to compete. Industry leaders began discussing him with a tone they once reserved for disruptors who changed markets rather than joined them. National media outlets published stories detailing his journey from repairing a broken computer at age 9 to becoming one of the youngest black CEOs in telecommunications. His innovations were no longer footnotes. They were headlines. Yet the moment that defined the day they realized he was the future did not occur on a stage or in a boardroom. It happened when an engineering director from a major competitor privately admitted to a colleague during a conference Freddie did not attend that they underestimated him. They believed Figgers Communication would remain a small regional provider. They never expected a young entrepreneur with limited funding to build hardware capable of challenging multinational firms. Now they saw that his approach, personal, agile, adaptive, represented the direction the industry was heading. Word of that comment reached Freddie through a friend in the field. He listened, nodded quietly, and returned to work. He did not celebrate. He did not slow down. His focus remained unchanged. He understood what leaders throughout history had learned. Becoming the future was not a moment. It was a responsibility. It meant building systems that endured. It meant working through doubt, competition, and pressure. It meant remembering why he began. As evening settled over Quincy, Freddie stepped outside his office and looked up at a sky filled with the same stars he had seen as a 9-year-old repairing a discarded computer. He knew that the world finally saw him differently, but he felt no distance from the boy he once was. He still believed that anything broken could be repaired, improved, or rebuilt entirely. And now, the world believed it too.